I will pass you over to John, and John will share the screen and begin his talk. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Can hopefully everybody see that? It's interesting that we had 101 people log in this evening, and we decided previously to call it Trimontium 101, so that's a bit of a coincidence. Thank you all for turning out this evening. It's a great pleasure to see so many come along to hear about our favourite Roman fort, and hopefully I can share with you some of my own joy that I get from exploring this period of the Iron Age and the amazingly rich artefacts and resources that we have here in the Scottish borders that represent this time period. So we're going to start off with a little fly around here of the fort. This was it during the drought of 2018. Hopefully we'll have a nice summer this year as well. And you can see beautifully the outline of all the streets and the main wall. And if you remember that main wall of the fort was about 6 to 8 feet thick, and it was simply a facing on a 23 feet thick earthen rampart, which is the sort of slightly darker area behind it that you see run in towards the centre of the fort. And we're just coming round now, you can see the two gate towers here of the east gate, and you'll notice that there are no interval towers that you can see, and there are no corner towers, and we'll come back to that when we look at something of the fort reconstruction at the end. So the sort of topics that I'm going to cover over the next 50 minutes or so are the rediscovery of the fort, Trimontium in its historical and geographic setting, life in the border zone, whether there was any evidence for trouble in the area. And you'll see when Carl excavated the site, he was perplexed by some of the findings that he made, and I'll share some of those conundrums with you. And then some mysteries, some unanswered questions, well, many unanswered questions around what we think we know and what we'd like to know more of about the fort as time goes by. So let's start off with the name. Some of you will remember Lawrence Keppie came along and gave us a talk many years ago now about the name Trimontium and what it means, and it seems almost self-evident really when you look at the Eildon Hills that this is the place of the three hills. This is Trimontium, and there could be no doubt about it. But for a long time there was, and part of the reason for that was an over-reliance on Ptolemy's map, which showed that Trimontium actually lay slightly more to the west, and it was confused with other hills near Burnswark, in fact. And for many years it was thought that the Eildons didn't represent Trimontium, but that was of course before the fort was actually found. This is the view from the east, that's Eildon Hill North there, and you can see the ditches of the hill fort and the little scalloped scoops of all the roundhouses, and more of that in a minute or two. But there is another Roman Trimontium, and some of you will already know this. Tonight's talk's going to give you some little factoids that some of you may or may not know, but hopefully you go away from it with one or two things that you haven't heard before. And Plovdiv in Bulgaria is also called Trimontium. This is a holiday brochure photograph of Plovdiv. But actually Plovdiv is known locally as the city of the Seven Hills, and actually not three hills. So the fact that it was called Trimontium just features the three bigger hills there. So there was another Trimontium, but the one that we're interested in was the one that Ptolemy put on his map, and here it is here. You can see the flyover, and it's pushed over to the west, and that is due to a miscalculation, because of course Ptolemy's map wasn't actually a map, it was a set of coordinates. And in the early medieval period, those coordinates were then converted into a map. And that's one of the reasons why Scotland cants over at this very unusual angle. It cants over to the east. And so too does Denmark, incidentally. So it's not just Scotland that has that funny wry neck on it. So Trimontium was definitely known to Ptolemy, who clearly knew it was above the line of the Tyne-Solway Isthmus. But what hard evidence have we got? Well, this is the Ingleston milestone, and right down at the bottom of the stone, relatively sort of muddily reconstructed here in this sort of tarted up version of the milestone that stands in the National Museum. You can see Trimontium engraved there at the bottom, and it was clearly from Ingleston. It's obviously 40 miles away, or 37 miles away, and so mileages were being given to and from Trimontium as far away as the sort of Antonine frontier. But there is one other piece of evidence. We had this in the museum a couple of years ago. This is a writing tablet. It's a wax tablet that's been scored through when someone's been leaning too heavily on it. And you can see here at the bottom right, Roger Tomlin's interpretation of this. And in the wax here, or in the wood, you can just make out Trimontio aut lugu. And that's Latin for the centurion Marcus Julius Martialis is at Trimontium or Lugavalium. And Lugavalium was, of course, Carlisle, which is where this piece of wooden artifact was found. So it's interesting to note that the Roman Postal Service was getting it right, and it had found its recipient before it had been sent erroneously to Trimontium. Although I suppose the opposite could be true. It may have gone to Trimontium and reached them sometime afterwards. But it's quite a nice little artifact to show that Trimontium was part of the Roman postal system as well. So just moving on. So how can you lose a fort? Well, that's part of the process of the passage of time, where stones are robbed and then eventually vegetation grows in and the site completely disappears. And largely due, I think, to stone robbing of a very major nature. And of course, when the site was started to be reinvestigated in the 1800s, a souterrain was found quite near to where Oakendene House is. It's just on the north side of the bypass, and a lot of Roman stones were included in that souterrain. So even the early medieval people had started making their own buildings out of it by that time period. But Sir Walter Scott was one of the premier antiquaries of the borders, and as you know, his house at Abbotsford is festooned with Roman material. But in the wall of Abbotsford, some of you may not know, is the only stone of the 22nd Legion to be in Scotland. And this legion is actually a German legion. They're from Mainz in Germany. It's the 22nd Primagina. You can see the prima at the bottom, or the primi at the bottom. And the 1 of the 22nd is kind of just missed off in the fragment. And so Walter Scott had this built in to the wall of Abbotsford, and it can still be seen there to this day. And I think that's quite a nice reminder that Scotland was not only the stomping ground of the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th, and for a while the 9th, but also 2 other legions, the 22nd and the 8th Augusta. The 8th Augusta was from Strasbourg. So who were the big figures in the rediscovery of Trimontium? Well, there was an interesting character called Thomas Vere back in the 1700s. In fact, in 1783, he ploughed up an altar to the east of the fort. And it's interesting that that altar doesn't really feature in Sir Walter Scott's writings, and it's a surprise because he was so he acquired so many Roman stones that I'm surprised it didn't actually end up eventually in the house in Abbotsford House. And Thomas Vere was a smallholder, but very much a borderer. He was followed by Thomas Todd of Dry Grange, whose workmen also found an altar to the south of the fort in 1830. And then John Alexander Smith, who became one of the early secretaries to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. He also has local origins. I think they were the Smiths of Darnick. And he found, or was led to find, material in the railway cutting that the North British Railway had put through the South Annex in 1846. And he pretty well made his name, his archaeological name, in publishing that material. So you can see that there was a fairly strong incline that there was a high likelihood that there was going to be a Roman installation very nearby. But it really came down to James Curl in the 1905 to 1910 excavations to produce the material that really put Newstead on the map. Down at the bottom, there is one relatively unsung hero, and that's Alexander Mackey, who was the Clerk of Works right through the 5 years of the excavations. But he had already cut his teeth on a number of other excavations for the Society of Antiquaries, particularly at Burnswark. That was the 1896 to 1898 dig at Burnswark. And then at Linefort, beyond Peebles, and at Balmuldy on the Antonine Wall, and Capac, which is the small fort at Oxton, just south of Newstead. So Alexander Mackey is, if you like, a bit of the, if any of you have seen the film The Dig, he's the relatively unsung but hard-working hero in the background. But it doesn't undermine at all what Curl did, because Curl really set to and did the hard work to get the news of Newstead out there. And if you look at past maps, the free site produced by the Scottish Government, you can get back to the late 1800s, 1900s maps that show these fine spots. The line at the bottom is the line of the British, the North British Railway, which is now the Melrose Bypass, which started, of course, the whole of the modern Trimontium Trust. And you can see at the top right, that's the altar that was found by Vere in 1783, and then the altar again found in 1830 to the south of the fort, and then the material publicised by Smith in 1846 and 1847 at the railway cutting. And the excavations between 1905 and 1910 were pretty strenuous. They went on continuously for 5 years, and they didn't stop for the winter season. They just carried straight on through. So Mr. Mackey must have been pretty well exhausted by the time it was finished. And of course, James Curl went down almost every day to see what material had been found and then take it back to his office to clean it and inspect it and write it up. So it was virtually a real-time archaeological project that was going on, so much so that Curl could write it up within the just a couple of years of the dig finishing. So he was a remarkable man, very organised, incredibly forward-looking, using all the latest techniques at the time, and making contacts, a real network of archaeological contacts. And Haverfield, who was the doyen of Romano-British archaeology, became first name friends with Curl. And there it is on the left, a Roman frontier post and its people, still a landmark publication, and the illustrations are superb. The writing is, the clarity of the writing is fantastic. And Curl's conclusions, many of Curl's conclusions still stand today, and he has his rightful place in the panoply of the big three of Romano-Scottish archaeology. So what about the fort in its setting? This map of the Roman Empire shows you literally just how far north this is. I mean, they were really pushing the boat out way up here. And it's not really any surprise that that this part of the world doesn't get tremendous amount of mention by the ancient authors, but mention it does get, particularly by Tacitus in the Agricola and by Dio, who talks about the campaigns of Severus in great detail, and we've heard about that from Simon Elliott. So let's have a look at Newstead through the phases of its occupation. In AD, round about AD 1886, this is about as far north as the Romans get in terms of permanent structures under Agricola, and Stracathro, we think was abandoned right there, right up there, just south of the Mount. Stracathro was abandoned round about AD 86 or AD 88. The latest coins, I think, are 86 from the fort. Then over the next few years, the Roman forces fall back in a very organised fashion. The forts are dismantled very tidily, and there's virtually nothing in terms of destruction levels. So clearly the Roman army were clearing up behind them all the way back to Camelin. And then things kind of halt there for a while. And that's when we get into this disputed period about when the final drawback came to go back to the sort of Staingate line between Carlisle and Corbridge. So for a while, Newstead then is out on its own, if you like. It's out on the point of the apex of the Roman advance. So at this point, it is a frontier post and was probably exposed more than the soldiers of the garrison would have liked. And at this point, something happens in the historical record. And it's likened by the Roman historians to what happened at the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a revolt that Hadrian had to deal with between 132 and 136. And when Frontinus is writing about this to Marcus Aurelius, he points out that Hadrian had a very bad time during the Bar Kokhba revolt, when he lost at least 1 or 2 legions. And at the same time, he reflects on the number of soldiers that he lost in Britain. And we're fairly confident that that big backlash came round about the 120, 121 AD period. So that's why this next map shows Hadrian's Wall with no Newstead on it at all. The Romans have fallen right back to the Tyne-Solway line, where the new wall is being built. Birrens may or may not be occupied at this point. Probably not. I suspect that the wall was the hard frontier. But then things change. We get a new emperor. We move on to Antoninus Pius in 138, and he very rapidly decides that he needs a victory. And the move to the Antonine Wall from Hadrian's Wall and the war that ensued was the only acclamation that Antoninus Pius received as imperator, apart from the one where he succeeds from Hadrian as his adopted son. So this was Antoninus Pius's claim to glory, this move that you see here in front of you. And again, Newstead features prominently, probably as a supply base, feeding up material and men to the Antonine Wall, pointing the road, Deer Street, pointing now at Inveresk. And you can see the prominence of Cramond and Inveresk here as the 2 ports that are going to be taking in material for the eastern end of the Antonine Wall. So this period in the AD 140s is going to be a period when Newstead is going to be very busy indeed, with a lot of troops and material going backwards and forwards along Deer Street. And then something else happens, another episode, this time recorded by Dio, and there is a great catastrophe occurs in AD 184, or round about 184. Historians and archaeologists have settled on that approximate date. And something happens, and that also coincides with the dating of the last coins from Newstead. So there seems to be some great conflagration again by about the mid-180s, when Newstead is abandoned in terms of being a permanent fort for the last time, and the Roman troops fall back to High Rochester and Risingham as the two outpost forts north of the wall from then until the 300s. It is worth pointing out something about the size of Newstead compared to all these other forts. Newstead over the ramparts is 16 acres in size. And for those of you that have been to Housesteads, which to me feels like a big fort, Housesteads is only 4 acres. It's just under 4 acres. So Newstead was almost between 3 and 4 times the size of Housesteads. So it gives you an idea when we come to reconstruct the fort, just how massive a structure we have to think about. And also, if I just flip back a slide, you can see that until the 180s, Newstead is exceptionally exposed. It's right out in front of Hadrian's Wall. At this point, archaeologists and historians have decided that the Antonine Wall has been abandoned for 20 years. I have my doubts about that. I think there's sufficient doubt about the coins that are sporadically turning up on the Antonine Wall that it was probably held later than the 160s, but it will only take further excavation really to establish that with any confidence. But whatever way, there is hard evidence that Newstead is occupied until the 180s as a relatively isolated installation. And then this revolt happens in the 180s, and the Romans fall back to Hadrian's Wall. Ulpius Marcellus is sent by the emperor to deal with the issue. That's Commodus sends Ulpius Marcellus, and there's a major reprisal takes place during that period, which might explain some of the closing down of some of the native settlements that have been noted in the central part of Scotland. And you can see, if you compare it with the German frontier, there are no forts out ahead of the frontier line. You can see that there's the chain of forts that form the German frontier facing Free Germany, but no exposed forts. So Newstead was in a pretty perilous situation, and I don't think we really fully understand the reason behind that. And so it's worth thinking about why that might be. That's just a close-up of the German frontier. I said it's a military zone. There's no Romanization in inverted commas of any of the territory. There are no villas. There are no public buildings. There's no proto towns at all. There are the native settlements, the indigenous settlements, and the Roman military. And you can see this if you go to Chew Green. The installations there are literally piled up on top of each other. I think there are about 7 or 8 camps, all just concertinaed one on top of the other, including a fortlet and a fort. The bigger thing in the background that you see there is a fort, and the thing in the foreground is an exceptionally heavily defended fortlet. Every time I look at that, it reminds me of a police station I once saw on the Falls Road. It's got that sort of intense armoured appearance. So that's Chew Green, but it's not just Chew Green. If you go to High Rochester, for those of you who go down the A68, just take time to turn up that little road and go to the fort at High Rochester. It's a beautiful fort to go and visit. This is it down here on this LiDAR image. But just look at the marching camps that are nearby. They are absolutely all over the place. And these things are visible on the surface. These haven't been ploughed out. They are just absolutely all over the shop. So the Roman army was moving up and down Deer Street, which is that absolutely straight line that you see going through the circle there. That's Deer Street going straight up. So if you get the chance, when you pop into High Rochester, just go and have a look at the fort, and you might be able to see some of these marching camps. Now, if we look at what the land that Newstead had been popped down in was not an empty landscape. This is an Ordnance Survey map of the area down towards the Cheviots from Newstead, from Melrose going south through Kelso. And when you look at the historic environment record, you can see these are indigenous homesteads. These are hill forts, these are fortified farmsteads, and all sorts of habitation right across the borderlands. And in fact, when you zoom out and look, this is the hill fort atlas of Britain, and the absence of hill forts south of the map, south of Hadrian's Wall, is not an artifact. That's a real phenomenon. There are no hill forts in that area. And you can see the number of hill forts right across what is the modern Anglo-Scottish border. And in fact, that very, very dense group right in the eastern shoulder is the densest group of hill forts in Europe. And a lot of these are not big, huge structures. They're fortified farmsteads, a bit like this one. This is a model in Bigger Museum, which is a great little museum if you get the chance to pop in and have a look. I say a great little museum, it's bigger than ours, but it's got some fantastic Iron Age material in it. And I'm going to show you a potpourri of some of the little forts in the area. These are just the tiny forts that are dotted around, all within about a 10 or 15 mile radius of Newstead. And these are just very small fortifications, but here are the big ones. This is Bonchester Hill. It's a huge native fort. And this is Ringchester's absolutely fantastic fort on the A7. This is the massive Hunham Law, which is just facing into Cheviot. This, of course, is the famous Woden Law, which overlooks the Roman camps. And here we have our own Trimontium. This is Eildon Hill North. These are the big forts. You're looking at the biggest fort in Scotland. This is 50 acres. And it is an incredible number of roundhouses. This is an image courtesy of Aberdeen University. This is a LiDAR image of Eildon Hill North. And every one of these dimples is a roundhouse 10 meters in diameter. And the surface is packed with them. This is not a loose village. This is a town, effectively up on the hill. And similarly with Hunham Law, it's not as easy to see at Hunham, but again, if you look closely, the surface is absolutely pockmarked in roundhouses, with a population on these hilltops between 1,500 and 3,000 people. And not only is it hill forts, there are huge swathes of ancient agricultural land. These are the lynchets that used to be thought to be medieval, but now we know that this particular type is much more likely to date right back to the Bronze Age. And this is a set over at Romano Bridge. Here are the famous lynchets over at Hunham Law. Hunham Law is to the upper left on this image. Absolutely incredible swathes of these cultivation terraces. And this is the Elsdon Valley, which if you get the chance, go down to Elsdon. It's just on the other side of Cheviot. Absolutely covered in ancient fields, amazing structures. These are hundreds and hundreds of acres. So the population here was obviously much bigger than we would have given credit for. And of course, you then get the Romans coming into that mix. So let's meet a couple of our Romans at Trimontium. Here are two of the altars that were ploughed up that I've already told you about. The one on the left to Ari. This is Arrius Domitianus, who was a centurion of the 20th Valeria Victrix. And if you look at the bottom of his inscription, just down here, you'll see the little chevron that indicates that the stone was put up by a centurion. And in the middle, we've got the Aelius Marcus's altar to the gods and goddesses of the parade ground. He was a cavalry officer of the Augusta Vocontiorum, who were a cavalry regiment that were raised in Gaul, in fact, very close to Orange, in fact, in Provence. So he and his men were a long way from home. And on the far right, we've got our famous Lucius Maximus Gaetulicus, who was also a centurion. If you look at the far right of the Gaetulicus, you'll see the little chevron again that tells you that's the little symbol for a centurion. And underneath, he hasn't finished, or the scribe hasn't finished off what legion, but we know more about him. And I just want to spend a second or two telling you a bit more about him, because he's an incredible character. Gaetulicus puts this altar up at Newstead, and then here at Castlesteads, on Hadrian's wall, another altar appears from him, again from Lucius Maximus Gaetulicus, clearly telling us now that he's a centurion of the 20th Legion. This is Isaaca, the Roman fort of Isaaca, which is also another great place to visit if you get the chance. It's slightly off the beaten track at Hadrian's wall. But that was not all. A few years ago, this stone turned up in Novi. Now, Novi is on the Danube in Bulgaria. And this is our man again. It tells us it's Lucius Maximus Gaetulicus. You can see that in the 3rd and 4th lines there of the inscription. It tells us that he's from Vienne, which is, of course, just south of Lyon. So we now know that he was a Gaul. And it tells us that he was a junior, a Tiro, T-I-R-O, you can see it there in the 4th bottom line, of the 20th Valeria Victrix. So that's quite nice. It ties quite nicely together the story. It then tells us that he was the primus pilus, the first spear of a new legion now. He's in the 1st Italica. And finally, the most stupendous fact of all, that he's been in the service for 57 years. Stipend STIP LV11 at the bottom. Votis soluit, he has completed his vow. And that 57 years is almost incredible. If he joined the army at the age of 19, 18 or 19, then he's going to be well over 70 when he's the first spear of the 1st Italica regiment. So what does that tell you? Well, it tells me that if you're the primus pilus, it's almost certainly a desk job, because I certainly don't think a 75-year-old is out running around with a big heavy shield and a spear, although you never know. But it is quite an incredible factor. The other interesting thing about him is he is apparently the 3rd longest lived or longest serving Roman soldier in the empire. There are 2 others who actually pip him to the post. One chap who'd done 58 years from Africa, and another one who had actually done 60 years in the service. So it tells you something too about longevity once people get past those early years of infant mortality. And it tells you something about the staggering mobility of people within the Roman Empire. You can see how plagues moved across Europe with the armies. It's not a surprise that the plague of Justinian and the plague of the Antonine plague moved around when you see the movements of these guys. So he starts off there in France, ends up in Scotland, going back to Hadrian's Wall, and then back to Novi. And he may not have been finished at Novi. It's not a funerary inscription. It's just an inscription that he's decided to put up to the health of the emperor. So what more can we find out? How can we get closer to the other people at Newstead, at Trimontium? Well, the answer comes really from the material from Curll's excavations in the pits and wells. There are 117 of these scattered across the site, mainly from the southern annex, but some from the other annexes and also from the centre of the fort. And these pits were anything from about 10 feet deep, and the deepest one here is coming in at 37 feet deep. Now that's pretty deep. And some of these were obviously wells because they contained black sticky material when they were excavated by Curll, but some were also refuse pits. But what Curll noted was, and this was his very, very rapid assessment, he clocked this right away, that the really exciting material was coming from the pits of the early occupation period, not the period between Trajan's withdrawal and Antoninus coming back again, but actually from that very early abandonment of the fort in the late 110s AD, if it's subsequently proven to be that. But that seems to be the period other material is being abandoned around the other forts in the south of Scotland and on Hadrian's Wall. So you can see the sort of material here. We're going to be getting a few of these Delabra back for display when we open again in July. And we're getting quite a lot of horse tack as well. And we're having our intaglios back again to have them displayed. But the Newstead masks really set the place aside. There's only one other place, one other Roman installation in Britain where a cavalry mask has come from, and that's from Ribchester. So to have 2 of these and 3 helmets is pretty good going. So National Museum have got these on display, obviously, and we've got Currell's own electrotype copy of the one in the upper right, the bronze mask, which you will see when we reopen again. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of other things that were found in the rich haul of material that Currell came across, and that is these phalleri. You can see that they're inscribed on the back. These would be on a centurion or a cavalry officer's armor or on the front of his tunic. These were his medals, if you like, and these are the backing plates to the phalleri. So these are bronze discs with Domitius Atticus's name scratched onto every single one of them. So why they ended up in one of the pits, we can only guess. Well, I suspect that Domitius Atticus was dead and that these were got rid of because they were either considered superstitious or were not welcomed by any new owner. But even more fascinating is that these 2 things. These are imago standards, also found in the pits. There would have been a little face of the emperor, either pasted or stuck on the central part of these solar halos. And these would have been held on the end of a shaft, rather like the one that we've seen in the cathedral on Hadrian's Wall at, oh yeah, I've gone and forgotten the name of the cathedral now, where the gravestone of Flavinus stands in the chancel of the cathedral. And at the top of his, he's a signifier, so at the top of his post or pole, you can actually see one of these imagos surrounded by a sort of little solar halo. So to have 2 of these, and as far as I know, these are unique. They keep popping up in books of Roman military equipment right across right across Europe in academic publications. So they are pretty astonishing finds. Right down to our canine friends, and this to me, when we were up at the National Museum store, when I saw the dog heads from Newstead, this really struck a chord. It really takes you right back to a domestic level. This, together with the children's shoes, made me really think about the people themselves that were in the fort over those 100 or so years. So what about life in the border zone? The Romans brought their comforts with them. This is the site of the amphitheatre over towards the viaduct. And it was almost certainly a wooden structure. Here's an artist's impression of a wooden amphitheatre put up, a temporary one put up in the Forum in Rome. And here is, even the emperors weren't averse to building wooden amphitheatres. This was the famous wooden amphitheatre of Nero, entirely wooden structure that burned down about 20 years later. So wood was clearly a big building material for even large structures. They brought with them their choice tablewares, and you can imagine the things that would be eaten or drunk from these objects. As a bronze flagon from one of the pits, exquisitely finished, probably from the Bay of Naples area. and everything inscribed. You know, you can see the punched detail here on weapons, helmets, and so on, the owner's inscriptions that really give you a contact with the past. And slightly tongue-in-cheek, this is Ron Embleton's painting, famous painting of the beer being brought back to the frontier. And this is, I like to imagine this coming up Deer Street to the cohort at Newstead, and as if to chime with that, our local brewery, Tempest Brewery, I want to put in a plug for the new Trimontium beer. It's very nice if you want to try it, and you can see there the artist's impression of the fort against the tweed and that very sort of trendy label. So try some Trimontium beer the next time you get the chance. I mentioned earlier that there may have been some trouble, but there obviously were good periods when things between the native population and the Romans was going reasonably well. There was clearly some trading, but we have to remember that the Romans came into a landscape that was populated by hill forts, and these hill forts were not up hills to be scenic tourist attractions. If you ever go to Sicily and have a look around you, it will amaze you that the towns are perched on pinnacles, while all the good building land, the flat land, has no buildings on it. And the reason for this is not to attract the tourists, it's because in the early medieval period or earlier, life was exceptionally uncertain and exceptionally dangerous. So these fortified farmsteads and hill forts that you see dotted across the borders were the progenitors of this sort of phenomenon. So when someone tells you that the indigenous people built their houses on the top of these inaccessible hilltops as a vanity statement, I think you should think twice about that and think about the secondary elaboration that might be going on in the individual's mind when they tell you that. And as I say, sometimes there almost certainly were good relationships going on, and farming was going on in the background. I mean, it was Rome's intention to tax, not to slaughter. And it was important to try and keep a province under control. But some of that taxation may have got perhaps out of hand. We know from Tacitus's writings that almost certainly sparked the Boudiccan revolt, and it was responsible for many other revolts, including some of the revolts in Judea, where unscrupulous procurators were making a mint on the side. And that would lead to periods of warfare. And our famous stone here on the closed road at the fort suggests that there were, 100 years of frontier episodes taking place. And there's not a lot of hard evidence for that, mainly because we haven't looked that hard. But the Borders Brochs give you some idea of what's going on. For those of you that have not seen a broch before, this is the broch at Carloway in the Isle of Lewis. It's one of the best ones to film. You get a real idea of the structure of it. To play that again, you can see that they're hollow wall construction, dry stone, maybe 20 to 30, 35 feet high, with multiple floor levels inside. Now, these brochs are dotted principally around the north, the northeast, and the northwest coasts. But curiously, there are three in the Borders, one at Bowbroch, one very close by at Torwood Lee, and another one out to the east near Duns at Edens Hall. And these three brochs are a bit of an anomaly. First of all, they stick out as being very southerly brochs. Secondly, they appear to have been built in the interlude between the first Roman invasion under Agricola and the second invasion of Antoninus Pius. We know this from material that's found below the foundation layers of the brochs. Some of the northern brochs are 100, 150, 200 BC, but our brochs, the three Borders brochs, are very much in the Roman invasion period. And there at the bottom is the beautiful broch at Edens Hall. So if you've never been there before, it's a fantastic walk. Take a walk out, great place to go and visit. And you can see it lies within a hill fort. And that hill fort is emulated by the one in the upper left, which is our very nearby Torwood Lee broch. which is just to the west of Galashiels. And on the upper right is the very ruined Bobroch, which is about 2 or 3 miles away. Now, these two top brochs, these two brochs in the upper row, were definitely forcibly destroyed. We know that when Pigott excavated Torwood Lee, and that's the same Pigott, by the way, that featured in the film The Dig, when Stuart Pigott dug at Torwood Lee, he found that the broch had been specifically and very deliberately thrown down, and his interpretation was that it had been thrown down during the Antonine reinvasion, or round about the Antonine reinvasion of the central lowlands. And if you have a look at the detail of Bobroch, you can see it has not collapsed symmetrically. Bobroch has been pushed, thrown down to the west and the northwest. And you can see that the stonework all cants over to a single side. And to me, this graphically displays how brutal the destruction of these brochs actually were. Now, we don't know it was the Romans that did this, but it certainly appears from the artifactual assemblage that the brochs ceased to function or ceased to exist round about the time of the Antonine occupation. So I think there's a fairly strong possibility that they represent trouble. And work coming up that may take place at Eildon Hill North in the coming season may tell us a bit more about that, because Aberdeen University are going to do some explorations there in the late summer to see if they can look at the continuity of the occupation on the hilltop. And it may occasionally have seemed like this, with retribution taking place for rebellions or for failure to pay taxes and so on. So there may have been a lot of strife on and off throughout that 100 years of occupation. And you don't have to look much further than the comparison between Hadrian's Wall, the building, the structure of Hadrian's Wall, and the German wall. The German limes stretches between the Rhine and the Danube, and effectively it's a wooden fence with a ditch in front of it, whereas Hadrian's Wall is a considerably more imposing structure. And in front of Hadrian's Wall are these unique pits and stakes, obviously to keep out people from the north. And these don't exist on any of the other frontiers, as far as we know as yet, although they may be found in the future. But at the moment, it's certainly looking as if for a long period, Hadrian's Wall was a pretty impermeable barrier. And when it comes to ditches, this is one of our friends, Axel Pozlushny, who's helped the Trust with a lot of their work with RGK, with the geophysics. This is Axel standing in the German ditch at the Saalburg to give you an idea of scale of the ditch. Now, as Crocodile Dundee would say, that's not a ditch. This is what I call a ditch. And this is my brother in the Antonine Wall ditch at Croy Hill. And that gives you a comparison of the size of the fortifications on these two frontiers. And this was picked up by Mommsen, of course, over 150 years ago, when he was writing about the potential for trouble on the northern frontier. The two walls, the Hadrian's Wall and the Antonine Wall, were absolutely over-engineered compared to other frontiers. So I suspect the garrison at Newstead did suffer a considerable amount of pressure over quite a long period of time. And you can see that the fortifications around the annexes are quite prominent, and that's unlike the forts, for example, on Hadrian's Wall, where the annexes are relatively poorly defined or not there at all, and the civil settlement just spreads out. And we wondered whether the geophysics that RGK would do would pick up evidence of the civil settlement outside the annexes to prove that wrong. But in fact, the geophysics, the magnetometry, effectively confirms what we thought. That is, all of the activity at Newstead is taking place in the annexes or within the fort itself. And all of these dark marks are evidence of burning, because they interfere with the magnetic composition of the soil. So I'm going to finish up briefly with some mysteries that we don't know the answers to. We're not sure where the bridge is, although Bill Loney and Donald did some digging on what was thought to be the line of Deer Street, and it looks pretty much as if the Roman bridge is under the foundations of the old bridge at Dry Grange at the flyover on the A68. But we're still not absolutely sure. We don't know where the main bathhouse is, because the bathhouse that's in the Western Annex is a subsidiary bathhouse belonging to the Mancio. We have no idea where the cemetery is. There must be a big cemetery, a garrison who have occupied the area on and off for over 100 years. There will be a lot of graves somewhere, and we don't know where those are. We suspect they might be on the rising ground to the south, in the line of where the bypass road came in from Deer Street, but we're not sure. And then, of course, there's the pits themselves. And I'm going to end up really with the mystery of the pits, because they really are an enduring mystery. We still don't know why the Romans abandoned so much material. And this is just pit 17 alone, without considering any of the other 117 pits. And you can see that there were stacks of things in here, including a lot of dead horses, horses, some of which had been specifically culled, and including human skeletal material. Now, Curl saw it as a catastrophe, and it just shows you how your point of view can shape your perspective of the evidence. He thought that a disaster had taken place, but Bill Manning thought that the material looked as though it was had been cast off surplus metalwork that was either awaiting repair or had served its serviceable life, and it was waiting for recycling. But then Simon Clark introduced the notion that this could have been ritual, and that the material, certainly the larger objects, the bodies and the things like armor and tools and so on, had been put there for a ritual purpose. It's quite difficult, though, when you've got these competing themes, to work out exactly what the answer is, and archaeologists will fight themselves to the death almost over some of these concepts. But it is worth remembering that the Romans did throw away a lot of stuff. Working from the bottom up, you can see at Loudon Hill, they threw away a whole pile of delabras and wheels and tires and tools. At Elginhoch, this is a little known fact that came as a surprise to me, 160 kilograms of nails were buried at Elginhoch, just outside Edinburgh, in the first, the Flavian fort there when they abandoned it. And at Inchtuthil, 9,000 kilograms of nails and tires was dumped. And every schoolboy in Scotland got one of those nails, I think, or every schoolboy like myself that was interested. And these are my 3 Inchtuthil nails that I was given when I was at high school in my Latin class. And our Latin teacher managed to get some of the thousands and thousands of spare nails that went eventually to Ravenscraig Steelworks to be melted down. And finally, we mustn't forget the toll of life that went into the pits as well. This is Trimontium man here on the right, a reconstructed skeleton or skull, and the horses. And as if by magic, here's one that we prepared earlier. This is the reconstruction. This is a laser print of the horse and the second bottom horse for teaching purposes when the new museum opens. So why were these horses slaughtered and put in the pits? We still don't know the answer to that. And finally, one of the great images, I think, of the fort, this is the fort in the drought, as I told you earlier on, in 2018. But in 2020, Fraser Hunter was flying to Germany and had just taken off from Edinburgh Airport and looked out the window, and of course it wasn't at the time of year when there were any crops, but the fields had been ploughed. And he phoned me from Germany to tell me to take a drone image of the fort, which I did. And this is the fort under the plough, not under crop. And what you see there is the carbon staining of the repeated burning of the fort. This is carbonized soil. And this is one of the reasons why the geophysics goes crazy, the magnetometry goes crazy. And to me, it's a graphic example of the destruction that took place ultimately at Newstead, presumably at some point in the 180s. So, but the fort now is rising from the ashes. This is Simon Fleming's reconstruction. Simon Fleming's our model maker that's working on the fly-through of the fort for the new museum. This is what it would have looked like at its heyday in round about 165. The dividing wall, for those of you who know, the fort was split for a while into two parts, with an industrial portion and with a military portion. But at this point, it's now a military installation again. It's an outpost fort north of the wall. It's got a big cavalry contingent over the back. And the buildings are absolutely superb. These are actual reconstructions from the ground plans of the buildings. This is the Praetorium with the Commandant's bathhouse, which you'll be able to see in more detail whenever Simon's finished it. And this is the interior of the exercise hall, looking across to the cross hall of the Principia. And you can see right through to the Chapel of the Standards at the back. This is the Chapel of the Standards here. For the Ides, the regimental standards were kept. I'm going to be able to see around the inside of this when it's complete. And the structure is based entirely on the footprint of Currell's excavations. And finally, this is the East Gate. And we now know that these gates were actually much taller. I showed you the aerial photograph of the crop marks of the towers of the East Gate. And this is how they would have looked as you were retreating from the East Gate into the sunset, as the fort slowly shut down for the night. And that inscription above the gate, Lawrence Keppie, who I think is probably watching or looking in this evening, is working on a specimen inscription for us to put up so that you'll be able to read it when the model's complete. So thank you all very much for your time and your attention this evening. It's been, I've run 5 minutes over time, so I hope I haven't overwhelmed you with all of that, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, John. That's fantastic. I'd like to thank you for that talk, and it was as cram full as the Scottish Borders is cram full of ancient sites, and myself coming from Devon, thinking that Dartmoor was a pretty packed landscape with its Bronze Age and later sites. Having moved to the Borders, it can't compete with the sheer quantity of sites spread out across. And tonight was a brilliant flavour, focusing on Trimontium and the broader Borders. There's been a few questions pop in. 3 or 4 people mentioned the name of the abbey that you couldn't quite remember, which I don't remember before at all. Hexham Abbey. Hexham Abbey. so Tom and Val, thanks for that. That's great.
I never do a talk with notes, so I had nothing to look at. I thought, I'm floundering.
And I think there was a question had come in from, let me quickly scan through. I'm just going to look through the notes. Yeah, there's a question from Alan Mack. If you want to unmute, Alan, did you want to fire your question at John?
Hi, John. Yes.
Hi, Alan.
A month or so back, I was listening on my phone to a podcast, and it was referring. It was a fairly brief podcast, but it was referring to the Roman occupation or the Roman attempt at occupation of Scotland, and it referred to Inchturthal.
See if I can get hold of it. I don't know how I can do this again.
Sorry.
Sorry, you mentioned an inch tussle.
Didn't make any mention of Trimontium whatsoever, which had me raging, actually. I felt like screaming down the phone. But it said that Inchtuthil was the largest fort in Scotland. Was that the case? I'd always kind of thought that Trimontium was the largest.
No, well, it depends what you class a fort and what you class a fortress. Trimontium's the largest fort. Inchtuthil is a legionary fortress, so a whole legion would have been in there, 6,000 men. So Inchtuthil, to put it in perspective, Trimontium is 15 acres, Housesteads is 4 acres, Vindolanda is 3.5 acres, but Inchtuthil's 52 acres.
Oh, right.
Now, Inchtuthil, though, was only occupied for like 1 season. So it is, if you like, the largest Roman structure in Scotland, but it wasn't, the buildings weren't completed. They started building the fortress and they just withdrew.
Right.
So you're right. You're absolutely correct. There is one other larger, not fort larger than Newstead. That's also a fortress, and that's the one at Carpoo on the Tay, which was Severus's fortress, probably I think for the 6th Legion, and it was very short-lived as well. Okay. So Newstead stuck it out for the 100 and odd years, pretty much out on its own for quite a lot of that time.
Right. Okay, that explains it. Thank you.
So that's a very, very astute question, though.
Lovely, thanks, Alan. That's great. If anyone's got their microphone on, if they could just mute it, because we're hearing a couple of orders for drinks and snacks coming through, which I quite like, but I don't think that's quite possible yet with the technology. There's a question coming from David Breer. Is David still with us, and does he like to unmute and ask?
Hi, thanks.
No,
can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good. I forgot to put the video on, so I don't know if I'm talking or not.
No, I can hear you.
Thanks very much, John. Loved it. Expected to love it. If you do find the cemeteries, obviously you'd love to excavate them. Are they likely to be within the protected area? Might they be outside and available for excavation, shall we say?
That's a very good question. I suspect, because of the broad scheduling of the site, I was thinking about this the other day there, actually, David, that's a very good question. The schedule for Newstead runs almost half a mile south of the fort itself. And the reason for that is the 8 huge temporary camps that surround the fort.
Yes, of course.
So you've got these big temporary camps, and I suspect that one of those temporary camps encompasses or partly encompasses where the cemetery was. So I suspect that we'll not get permission to excavate it, but I hope that geophysics might actually find it, because if you look at the graves at High Rochester, I was going to put a video in this evening of High Rochester, a drone video. If you get the chance, go and have a look at the graveyard at High Rochester.
Yeah, it's on my list.
It's an amazing place, and they've got a lot of those graves have got ring ditches around them.
Yeah.
And we should be able to find those by geophys, and if we can work backwards, southwards where the road is, we'll be able to find the graveyard. But we've never done geophysics that far south of the fort.
No. I mean, the thing that just thinking about it offhand, I just wonder whether the cemeteries are likely to be where the marching camps are. That's the whole military area, presumably given over, dedicated to military use, and the cemeteries will probably be outside that.
Well, I would hope so. Hope so. But the biggest marching camp we think is the Severan one, so that camp may have been put in maybe 20 years after the fort was abandoned in the 180s or 30 years. So who knows whether they would have respected where the graves were at that point.
Good luck.
So yeah, well, hopefully we're trying to get our German friends to do geophysics to the south.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks so much. We've got a message come from Stephen. Stephen, I'm just trying to. There we go. Stephen Higgs from Carlisle City Council. Just reminding about Hadrian's Wall's 1900th anniversary next year. And there's a year-long festival of events, etc., with the hashtag HW1900, and then the website hadrianswallcountry.co.uk. There's the link in the chat, so people can jump there and pull that link off, and we'll publicise the link as well through our social media. So thanks, Stephen. That's great, lovely. There's a question come in from Sharon Kampf, on burials as well. So did you want to fire away, Sharon, if you're still with us? Maybe Sharon's not unmuted or is no longer with us. She mentioned, she asks whether she saw mention of burials mentioned when the railway was built during that period. Is she correct?
No. Well, I think there was one cinerary urn found during that period. It wasn't a graveyard. There were occasional little cremations around the fort. So there was in a drain, there was a cinerary urn found, which is very odd. All the bodies that are found in the wells are clearly not buried with any ceremony. So these people are either victims, or they're criminals, or they're people that have been executed. So they don't find their way into those wells by accident, and they're not there for a formal burial. So there are bodies and body parts, and there's lots of body parts found around the outside of the fort in the ditches. So mandibles, skulls that have fallen off poles that have been round the walls. They're found in the ditches, but they're not burials. They're bits. And I've actually been stunned by, when you read any textbook of Iron Age archaeology, the random bits of body that turn up on sites is absolutely incredible. I mean, there are bits of leg and hands and skulls and jaws turning up under floorboards and all over the place. So we're not fully, we just don't understand the burial practices and the distribution practices that took place with bits of the dead. So, but in terms of a formal cemetery, there's nothing so far.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Thanks, John. And I hope Sharon, you may be still with us and you're able to hear that. There is a question popped up here. It's from John Henderson, talking about the signal station. John, are you still with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
yep,
we can.
Just a question for John. According to Mordana's survey map, Eildon Hill North is marked as a Roman signal station. Are there any clues or indications as to where the adjacent signal stations were for that?
That's a great question, John. In fact, you've got two parts of my name. I'm John Henderson Reid, so there you go. Must be a good question. There was thought to be a signal station on Ruberslaw, which is just outside Hoyk.
Yeah.
And then the next signal station from there is going to be up near Wodenlaw. And there's one missing there. There should be one at Wodenlaw, because there's a sign of light, a line of sight from there, virtually over to Chew Green. So Chew Green to Wodenlaw, Wodenlaw to Ruberslaw, Ruberslaw to Eildon Hill North. Going northwards, anybody who drives down the A68, you will see Eildon Hill North appear as you just go over Sutra. So there must be, Oxton's too low, the fortlet at Oxton's too low to see it. But somewhere on Sutra, probably on Deer Street on Sutra, there's a missing signal station there. So that's the one to the north, and Ruberslaw is the one to the south.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much. I didn't know about these other signal stations. That's very interesting. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you, John, for asking, and John for answering. Fantastic. That's most of the questions from the chat feature done now. Stephen's just, Higgs from Carlisle again, has just messaged that actually they've applied for lottery funding and planning a dig at Carlisle Cricket Club, hopefully this summer. where there will be a call for volunteer diggers. So so there's over 100 of us here today, so who knows, there may be some people here who fancy getting in the mud.
The Carlisle Cricket Club, Rob, they found some amazing stuff there a couple of years ago, so that would be a really interesting dig to go on.
Fantastic. That's a nice way to finish the evening, with the potential for getting outside and getting together again, which will be nice. I just take the opportunity to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Fantastic numbers, 131 we got to, which is fantastic. And thanks so much to John for putting together tonight. There have been endless messages thanking him for his talk tonight, discussing the quality and quantity of content and the interesting nature of what was discussed. No doubt about it. The talks are recorded. This is talk number 4. They are up on our website, where you can watch them at your leisure and re-watch them. So there's plenty of material here to go back over again, as well as from our other talks earlier in the year. So thanks so much, John, and thanks everybody. Have a good evening, and we will hopefully see as many of you as possible in a month's time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.